The night Valentina Rios realized her past wasn't as buried as she thought. She was wearing a midnight blue dress, the one she'd bought with last year's bonus, and saved for an occasion worth the wait. This was that occasion. The annual Investment and Business Innovation Gala for Madrid's financial sector was being held at the Cibeles Palace, and Valentina had spent the last 3 weeks organizing every detail. The tables, the speeches, the names on the place cards, the wine selections, the order in which the executives would arrive. She knew this event better than any guest there, better, even, than her own boss. Alejandro Vidal arrived at 9 o'clock sharp. As always, not a minute early, never a minute late. Valentina watched him cross the main entrance with that walk of his, calm, absolute, as if the room simply rearranged itself around him without him ever having to ask. Dark suit, no tie, top button undone. On a less self-assured man, it might have looked careless. On Alejandro, it looked like a decision. The representative from Atlantica Investments arrives in 20 minutes. She said the moment he reached her, tablet in hand, no preamble. Table 12 is confirmed. Mr. Herrera asked to switch from white wine to red, already handled. And the microphone on stage has a slight feedback issue the technician should fix before 10. Alejandro looked at her for a second. Did you go to the sound check yourself? Someone had to. He said nothing else. He took the glass a waiter offered him in passing and kept walking. Valentina read it the way she always did, silent approval. She'd worked for this man for 3 years and had learned his particular language. A long pause meant a problem. A short one meant good enough. The night unfolded with the precision she had built into it. The speeches ran on time. The music stayed tasteful and unobtrusive. Valentina moved between groups with her tablet, invisible in the way only the truly efficient know how to be, present without interrupting, attentive without hovering. It was on her third pass between the head table and the side corridor when she saw him. It wasn't gradual. It was instant, like when the light changes suddenly and the eye needs a second to adjust. Marcos del Solar was standing at the far end of the room near the bar, drink in hand, a woman beside him laughing with her head tipped back. Valentina stopped. Her body made the decision before her mind did. She froze in the middle of the hallway, tablet pressed against her chest, and felt the noise of the room pull away, as if someone had turned up the volume on her own internal silence. Marcos. Here. It had been 2 years since she'd seen him in person. She'd seen him in industry magazines, in articles about business expansion, in an interview someone shared in their old university group chat, one she'd closed before finishing the first paragraph. But seeing him here, in the same room, 20 feet away, with that posture, that way of occupying space as if it belonged to him by natural right. He turned his head. He saw her, and he smiled. It wasn't a smile of surprise. It was a smile of recognition, slow, calculated, the smile of someone who already knew she'd be there and had decided in advance exactly how he'd react. Valentina felt the cold climb up her spine like water. She took a breath, stepped left toward the side corridor, intending to disappear into the crowd and buy herself some time. But he had already excused himself from the woman beside him and was walking toward her with that poisonous calm it had taken Valentina 3 years to learn to name correctly. Manipulation. What looked like confidence was manipulation. Valentina, he said when he reached her, his voice modulating warmth like it was an instrument he played. I didn't know you'd be here tonight. I organized it, she answered, and hated herself the instant the words left her mouth, because her voice came out a register lower than she wanted. Of course. Marcos tilted his head slightly, looking her up and down with something that resembled admiration but was really inventory. You're still the most efficient person in any room you walk into. That never changed. The compliment had an edge. Valentina recognized it because she'd spent 3 years receiving compliments with edges, and it had taken her too long to learn how to dodge them. Marcos, if you'll excuse me, I have. How are you? He cut her off, taking half a step closer. No, really, how are you? It was a simple question. For words. But he used them like a key, as if the mere act of asking gave him the right to an intimate answer, to an accounting of her life, to a piece of her that didn't belong to him. Valentina opened her mouth. She's doing very well. The voice came from her left. Alejandro Vidal appeared at her side with an ease that had no logical explanation. She hadn't called him, hadn't seen him approach, and yet there he was, 15 centimeters away, drink in hand, his expression not quite anything at all, and somehow filling the entire space around them. Marcos looked up at him. Something flickered across his face, quick, before the mask slid back into place. Vidal, he said, in a tone meant to sound cordial. Del Solar. Alejandro didn't extend his hand. It wasn't hostile, exactly, it was simply an omission. And this man's omissions always said more than his words. Sorry to interrupt, they were stealing my date. The pause that followed was perfect. A sentence that confirmed nothing, denied nothing, and floated in the space between the three of them like a question nobody had asked out loud, but everyone heard anyway. My date. Valentina didn't breathe. Marcos del Solar, a man who had spent his entire adult life being the most self-assured person in any room, was, for the first time, caught without his next move. His smile didn't disappear entirely, but it lost its edge. It became decorative. Useless. Of course, he said finally. Didn't mean to interrupt. You didn't interrupt anything important, Alejandro replied, with a politeness so perfectly constructed there was no way to find its limit, no way to call it hostile. And then, with the most casual gesture in the world, he rested his hand on the small of Valentina's back. It wasn't an embrace. It wasn't possessive. It was simply an open hand at the exact center of her back, the pressure so light it could have passed for accidental. And yet it was nothing of the sort. Valentina felt the warmth of that hand straight through the fabric of her dress. Marcos looked at the two of them, nodded once, gathered up what remained of his smile, and walked off toward the bar without another word. Alejandro withdrew his hand. It took Valentina a moment to remember how her lungs worked. Thank you, she said, without looking at him. The microphone on stage, he replied. Already taken care of. And he kept walking. The narrator wants to pause here for a moment. This man just used his right hand to rewrite an entire evening, and the first thing he asked about afterward was a microphone. Take note. This is going to be a long story. They left the gala together at 11:15, because the events Valentina organized always ended on time. She'd made sure of that too. Alejandro's car was waiting at the side entrance. The driver opened the back door, and Valentina assumed, as always, that this was where they'd say goodnight. Get in, he said. My metro stop is. Get in, Valentina. It wasn't an order. Or maybe it was, but the kind that didn't need volume to be won. She got in. The absurd part was that Alejandro's hand had left her back more than 2 hours ago, and yet Valentina could still feel it. A phantom pressure, warm and inexplicable, right in the center of her spine, as if the fabric of her dress had held on to the memory of that gesture better than her own reason had. They crossed several minutes of Madrid in silence. The lights of Gran Via slid past the window in neat little flashes. Valentina had the tablet on her lap, though she wasn't looking at it. You didn't have to do that, she said finally. I know. Then why did you? Alejandro looked straight ahead. 1 second. 2. Because that man was enjoying watching you be uncomfortable. Valentina didn't know what to say. The words sat inside her, shifting, finding nowhere to land. Do you know him well? He asked. Well enough. A brief silence. This time he didn't break it, and Valentina understood that this, too, was a choice. The car pulled up in front of her building in Malesana. She gathered her bag, stepped out, and just as she was about to close the door, she turned back. Alejandro. It was the first time in 3 years she'd called him by his first name. They both noticed. Good night, she said. He looked at her from inside the car with that expression that wasn't quite anything, and answered, Good night. The door closed. The car pulled away. Valentina stood on the sidewalk for a few seconds, the November cold of Madrid settling into her shoulders, wondering exactly what had just happened. She had no answer. But for the first time in a long while, the question didn't scare her. If this story has you hooked, subscribe and hit the bell. Here on Fall in Love with This Story, we share original tales every week, written to move you, surprise you, and keep you company for a little while. And now, tell me something. Has someone ever shown up right on time, promising nothing, but somehow making you feel like you weren't alone anymore? I'll be reading the comments. It was 12:20 when Valentina's phone buzzed on the nightstand. She'd gotten home. She'd taken off the blue dress more carefully than usual, hung it up instead of leaving it on the chair like she normally did, and told herself that didn't mean anything, that putting it away properly was just a habit of tidiness, that it had nothing to do with wanting to keep the night that dress had held intact. She'd lied to herself elegantly. She was good at that. The message came from a number she hadn't saved, but recognized instantly. There are numbers the body remembers, even after the mind has decided to forget them. I see you go for men with more money than patience these days. Or maybe you always knew exactly who to look at. I'm surprised, Valentina. I always thought you were too proud for that kind of move. She read it twice. The first time, she felt the hit. The second time, she studied it, the way you study a wound, to gauge how deep it goes before deciding whether it's worth tending to. Marcos wasn't furious. That would have been simpler. Marcos was surgical. He knew exactly which word to use. Proud. He knew Valentina had spent years protecting herself from being seen as someone who used connections to climb, someone who was interested. And he'd placed his finger right there, with the precision of someone who'd studied the map of her insecurities from the inside, because he'd had years to do it. She set the phone face down on the nightstand, turned off the light, and lay staring at the dark ceiling of her apartment in Malesana, listening to the muffled sound of Madrid at midnight, thinking about 4 years ago, about an expansion strategy she had designed for a mid-sized tech company, 6 months of work, that she had shown to Marcos because back then she trusted him, because back then she believed sharing was an act of love and not naivety. And how 8 months later, Marcos del Solar had presented that exact project to a board of directors with his name on the cover page, and walked away with a €4 million contract that had launched him to where he was now. She'd left him 2 weeks after she found out. He'd never admitted it. He never would. Valentina closed her eyes. You're nobody without someone backing you. He'd said that to her once, casually, in that way he had of poisoning the air of a room without raising his voice. You're efficient, sure, but efficiency without vision is just service. It had taken her a year to stop hearing that sentence in her own head. She clenched her jaw, turned over in bed, and decided she wasn't going to answer. She didn't. What Valentina didn't know that night was that Alejandro Vidal had gone home to his apartment in Salamanca, poured 2 fingers of whiskey he never finished, and stood for 40 minutes at the window, looking out at the lights of Madrid. He'd spent days digging into Marcos del Solar ever since he'd learned the man was circling the Atlantica negotiation. And what he'd found out about Valentina along the way wasn't just background information. It was, though he wouldn't have called it that yet, the reason he had crossed that ballroom without thinking twice. The next morning, the Vidal Group office woke up the way it always did, punctual, orderly, coffee already made by the time Valentina arrived at 8:15. She set down her bag, turned on her computer, checked the day's schedule, and told herself that last night had been an anomaly, a gesture from her boss in an awkward moment. Nothing more. Alejandro arrived at 8 on the dot, walked past her desk without stopping, went into his office, and closed the door. Normal. Completely normal. At 9:10, he called her on the intercom. Valentina, I need to speak with you. She grabbed her notebook and went in. Alejandro was standing by the window with his back to her, hands in his pockets. When she closed the door, he turned around. Sit down. She sat. He didn't. This morning I received some information about Marcos del Solar, he said. Direct, no preamble. He's in talks with Atlantica Investments for a contract we're also negotiating, and apparently, he's using last night as leverage for the story he's telling. Valentina frowned. What kind of leverage? He's suggesting, in certain circles, that you have privileged access to Vidal Group information, that our relationship gives you an unfair advantage. Valentina's stomach dropped. That's false. I know. You don't. I know, he repeated, with a firmness that left no room for doubt. I'm not questioning you. I'm informing you. Valentina pressed her notebook between her hands. So last night's gesture hurt me. Last night's gesture was mine. The consequences are mine too. Alejandro moved to his desk, sat down, and looked at her with that calculating expression he wore when he was weighing something. Here's what I'm proposing. For the next few weeks, we don't deny anything. We let the rumor exist, but controlled. If we're the ones steering the narrative, Del Solar has nothing to work with. Valentina stared at him. You're proposing we pretend to be in a relationship. That's not a question. I'm proposing we don't deny something the public has already assumed. It's the same thing. Not exactly. What's the difference? The difference, he said, with a patience that, for him, was almost unusual, is that we know the truth. What everyone else chooses to interpret is their problem. Valentina dropped the notebook onto her knee. And if I don't want people interpreting anything about my personal life, Alejandro didn't answer right away. He looked at her for a moment, and in that moment Valentina had the strange sensation that he was choosing his words with a care that wasn't usually like him. "That man is using you to damage your professional reputation," he said finally. "I can help make sure that doesn't work. But I need you to trust me." "Trust you?" Valentina let out a slow breath. "You, who until last night didn't even know if I had family." Something crossed Alejandro's face so fast she couldn't name it. "You're right," he admitted. "I didn't know." The honesty of that answer threw her off more than any argument could have. She sat in silence for a few seconds, then nodded slowly, once. "Two conditions," she said. "First, this ends the moment the Atlantica contract closes or falls through. Second, nothing happens without my explicit approval." "Agreed. And if at any point this hurts me more than it protects me, I say so, and it's over." "Also agreed." Valentina stood up. "So what's next?" Alejandro opened a folder on his desk. "There's a private dinner Thursday. Atlantica, 3 of their partners, and Del Solar. You'd come with me, as my assistant, or as my date." He looked at her. As the person who designed the expansion strategy Del Solar presented 4 years ago as his own. The world stopped. Valentina felt the air in the room change density. "How do you know that?" she asked, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted. Alejandro opened the side drawer of his desk and pulled out a thin folder. He slid it across the desk toward her. It was a copy of the project, her project, with her handwriting in the margins, her notes, the correct date. "For years and 3 months ago. I've been digging into Del Solar's history since he started circling Atlantica," he said. This turned up in a file nobody had thought to destroy. Valentina didn't touch the folder. She looked down at it, hands still at her sides, and felt something strange. Not relief, not exactly. It was closer to what you feel when you've been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and someone, without asking permission, simply steps in and helps you hold it. She didn't know if she wanted the help. She didn't know if she could let herself accept it. "What do you plan to do with it?" she asked. "For now, nothing. It's yours." He closed the folder. "You decide what to do with it and when." Valentina picked up the folder. 3 years at Vidal Group. 1 year before that searching for solid ground after the wreckage, and in all 4 of those years, she had never once laid eyes on that project again. She pressed it against her chest and nodded once. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he confirmed. She walked out of the office, closed the door carefully, and stood for a moment at her own desk, looking down at the folder in her hands, thinking that this man had spent 3 years never asking her a single personal question, and in 48 hours, he'd found the proof she'd long given up as lost forever. The narrator needs to say something here. Some people take care of you quietly, without announcing it, without asking for credit, and when you finally notice, you don't know whether to hug them or run. Valentina, for the moment, chose to stay still. It was a start. The restaurant was the kind with no menu posted outside, where reservations are made weeks in advance, dark walls, warm lighting, tables spaced far enough apart that a private conversation actually stayed private. Valentina arrived before Alejandro, because she always arrived first. She sat down, ordered water, and spent 10 minutes mentally reviewing everything she knew about Atlantica's 3 partners, their investment histories, their negotiating weaknesses. It was what she did when she was nervous. She worked. Marcos del Solar arrived with the partners and saw her from the entrance. Something tightened in his jaw, just before his smile rearranged itself back into place. Alejandro arrived 2 minutes later, spotted her from the door, and walked toward her without hurrying. When he reached the table, he did something Valentina didn't expect. He brushed her shoulder lightly with his fingers as he sat down. The briefest gesture, almost absent-minded, the kind real couples make without thinking. She didn't move. She absorbed the touch and kept her eyes on the menu. Dinner unfolded in the language of polished business, broad conversation, calibrated anecdotes, evaluations dressed up as small talk. Valentina spoke little at first, observed a great deal, and stepped in at 2 precise moments with details that caught one of the Atlantica partners off guard. Details Alejandro hadn't expected her to have. He glanced at her sideways. She didn't look back. It was the senior partner, a white-haired man with old-fashioned manners, who finally asked the question everyone knew was coming. "Vidal, we've spent years seeing you alone at these tables." He smiled toward Valentina. "Since when the change?" The pause that followed lasted exactly as long as it needed to feel natural. Since before she noticed, Alejandro said. Valentina looked up from her glass. He kept going, addressing the partner, not her. I was slower than I usually am in business. But some things are worth the patience. Soft laughter around the table. Approval. The senior partner nodded with the satisfaction of a man who believed orderly love was a sign of character. Valentina took a sip of wine. Inside her, something shifted in a place she'd kept cordoned off for 4 years. Marcos, 2 seats down, said nothing. He cut his meat with more precision than necessary. It was later, when the partners stepped away for a moment and the 3 of them were left alone at the table, that he spoke. What a well-built scene, Marcos said. In that low voice he reserved for things he wanted only her to hear. You were always good at producing what other people wanted to see, Valentina. She opened her mouth. Del Solar. Alejandro's voice cut through the air without rising even a degree. There's one thing I admire about you, consistency. You've spent years building your career on other people's work, and you still have the elegance to call it producing someone else's talent. Marcos looked at him. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. Alejandro folded his napkin on the table with a calm that was almost insulting. And very soon, Atlantica's partners will know it too. But that's a conversation for another time. Tonight, I just wanted you to know, the file exists. The color drained from Marcos's face for a fraction of a second. Just a fraction. Enough. The partners returned to the table. The conversation continued. And Valentina, who had spent 4 years feeling small every time she remembered that project, that betrayal, that voice telling her you're just efficiency without vision, felt, for the first time, something that wasn't quite pride, but came very close. They left together at 11. The November air in Madrid had that clean cold that smells like a city breathing. They walked half a block before Valentina spoke. You didn't have to do that tonight. Bringing up the file, using it as a threat. It wasn't a threat. It was information. It's the same thing. We've already had this conversation. Valentina stopped walking. He stopped too, a step ahead, and turned around. Why? She asked. Really? Why does this matter to you? Alejandro looked at her. The streetlights cast an odd angle across his face, more human than usual. Because what that man did to you was a real injustice, he said. And real injustices have solutions, if someone bothers to look for them. That's a corporate answer. Yes, there's another answer that isn't. A pause, heavier than the ones before. Not tonight, he said finally, and kept walking. Valentina followed 2 steps behind, wondering what kind of man kept answers in reserve for later, and whether the moment would ever come when he actually said them. November turned into December with the speed months have when you're too busy to count them. Valentina noticed the changes in Alejandro the way you notice a painting someone move 2 inches. Something's different, but you have to stop and figure out what. The first change was small. One Tuesday at 11 in the morning, he poked his head out of his office and asked, with no context at all, "Have you eaten?" Valentina looked up. It's 11 in the morning. That's not an answer to my question. Yes, I've eaten. I had a good breakfast. And he disappeared. She stared at the closed door for a full 3 seconds. The second change was bigger. During a meeting with 2 finance executives, one of them made an offhand, condescending comment about a proposal Valentina had prepared. It wasn't a direct insult, it was the subtle kind, an interesting approach for someone without formal financial training. Alejandro, who'd been reading a document, looked up. That proposal was reviewed by me before this meeting, he said, perfectly calm. If you have technical concerns, I'll hear them. If your concern is about who wrote it, that doesn't interest me. The executive said nothing else. Neither did Valentina, but she wrote less in her notebook for the rest of the meeting, because her fingers had started to shake, just slightly. The third was a Wednesday afternoon. He passed her desk, stopped, and asked without quite looking at her, "Do you have family in Madrid?" She looked up. "My mother lives in Getafe. I visit her most Sundays when I can." He nodded, as if filing the information away somewhere internal, and kept walking toward the conference room. Valentina watched him go and thought that this man was learning to ask questions the way some adults learn to swim, with excessive concentration, a little clumsy, absolutely determined not to sink. It was Isabel Montez who showed up one Thursday afternoon, no appointment. Valentina knew her by name and by photograph, Alejandro's ex, a partner at an investment fund, The kind of woman who walked into a room and recalibrated the space in her favor without seeming to try. 42. Carried with the kind of elegance that costs money and discipline. He's in a meeting, Valentina said. He has an appointment. I don't need one. Isabel smiled, and it wasn't a smile for her, it was a smile about her. But I can wait. She sat down on the lobby sofa with the posture of someone who'd waited on that sofa before. You're Valentina, aren't you? Vital's assistant. Yes, I know who you are. Isabel looked at her with a curiosity that wasn't hostile so much as dissecting. I've heard some interesting things these last few weeks. Valentina didn't respond. I'm not telling you this to hurt you, Isabel continued, with the kind of softness people use when they very much do want to hurt you. I'm telling you because someone should. Alejandro protects things he considers useful. That's how he relates to the world. Don't mistake that for love. The air in the lobby went still. Valentina looked at her for a moment, then smiled, faintly, with the same polite acknowledgement you give to unsolicited advice. I'll let him know when he's out, she said. Isabel nodded, crossed her legs, took out her phone. Valentina went back to her desk, set her fingers on the keyboard, and stared at the screen without reading anything, because Isabel's words had landed exactly where they were designed to land. He protects things he considers useful. That was what this was. She was a piece in a corporate strategy, just like she'd always been for Marcos. The doubt wasn't new, but Isabel had given it precise words, and precise words are more dangerous than vague ones. Nobody plants a doubt with more elegance than someone smiling while they do it. Isabel Montes was very good at that. The problem is that the doubts that hurt the most usually have a kernel of truth inside them, and that's what makes them so hard to ignore. The meeting with the Barcelona investment group was a last-minute decision, the kind Alejandro made at a speed that forced everything else to rearrange itself around it. Tomorrow, he said, one Wednesday at 6 in the evening. 8 o'clock train. Meeting at 11. Working lunch. Back on the 7 o'clock high speed. Should I book the tickets? Already booked. Do you need me to prepare the? Already in your inbox. Valentina closed her mouth. Is there anything that isn't already handled? She asked, with a tone bordering on irony. He looked at her. Yes. I don't know if you'd prefer window or aisle. A brief pause. Window, she said. Good. And that was it. The high-speed train left right on time, the way trains do when you need time to prepare and time refuses to cooperate. Madrid disappeared behind them within minutes, and the flat expanse of the Castilian plateau unrolled outside the window, the kind of landscape that either calms you or unsettles you, depending on your mood. Valentina had the briefing folder open on her lap. Alejandro was reading something on his tablet. They traveled 40 minutes in a silence that was functional, professional, completely normal. It was he who broke it. Why did you choose to be an executive assistant? She looked up. Sorry, you're capable of more. I've known that for a while. Why this role? Valentina closed the folder slowly. Because when I entered the job market, I needed stability, not ambition, she said. My mother was starting to have health problems. A senior assistant position at a company like yours meant security. Good pay, predictable hours. None of the uncertainty of a management role where everything depends on quarterly results. And now? Is it still enough? Valentina looked at him. It was a direct question, no decoration, the kind he asked when he decided to ask something and found no reason to hide it. I don't know, she admitted. It's been a while since I asked myself that. You should. Why does it matter to you? He glanced toward the window for a moment. The landscape sped by. Because I recently realized I don't know anything about the person who keeps my company running, he said. That's a management failure. And something else, too. Something I don't know how to name yet. The train passed through a tunnel, a second of complete darkness. When the light came back, neither of them had changed position, but something in the space between their two seats was different. Narrower. As if the tunnel had compressed it slightly. My dream was to have my own strategy consultancy, Valentina said, without him having asked directly. Small. Specialized in expansion for mid-sized companies. I even had the name picked out. What is it? She hesitated. Rios Estrategia. Very original, I know. He didn't laugh, but something at the corner of his mouth moved. Do you still want it? Some mornings, yes. Other times it feels like a fantasy from when I was younger and less realistic. The difference between a fantasy and a plan, he said, is just the execution date. Valentina looked at him. That's the closest thing to a motivational speech I've heard from you in 3 years. Don't repeat that. Too late. Valentina laughed, a short, genuine laugh that escaped before she could decide whether it was appropriate. Alejandro watched her laugh, and for exactly 2 seconds, something in his face was completely unlike anything Valentina had seen in 3 years of working beside him. Then he went back to his tablet, and neither of them said anything else until Barcelona. The meeting went well. Valentina spoke up 3 times, each with surgical precision, and on the third, the director of the investment group looked at her with an attention that had nothing condescending in it at all. At lunch, someone asked if she was a partner at Vidal Group. She opened her mouth to say no. Not yet, Alejandro said from his chair, without looking up from the menu. Valentina closed her mouth. The director smiled, and Alejandro kept reading the menu as if he hadn't said anything particularly significant, though they both knew he had. Lunch continued with that particular energy meetings have when they're going well, looser, more personal, the wine doing its usual diplomatic work. It was the youngest partner in the group, a man of about 35 named Inigo, who started addressing Valentina more directly. It wasn't inappropriate. It was simply the attention of someone who'd noticed that the smartest person at the table wasn't necessarily the one talking the most. "Have you been in the industry long?" he asked, turning to her with a smile that was entirely professional and, at the same time, not entirely. "A few years," Valentina answered. "Though I come more from the strategy side than pure investment. It shows." Inigo tilted his head slightly. "Your point earlier about the secondary markets was the sharpest thing I've heard in a long time. Do you have a card?" Valentina opened her mouth to answer. Alejandro, who was cutting his second course with the unnecessary concentration of a man who had suddenly found his steak fascinating, glanced up, just for a second, quick and controlled, like all his movements. But it was the look of a man who'd just noticed something he didn't like, and was deciding whether that bothered him or not. And the answer, though he hadn't admitted it yet, not out loud and not even to himself, was that yes, it bothered him. Not reasonably, not in proportion to the situation. It simply bothered him, with that dull, irrational irritation that has exactly one explanation, and he wasn't ready to give that explanation a name yet. He went back to his steak. "Rios Estrategia," he said from his seat, without looking up. "She doesn't have a card yet, because she doesn't have an office yet. But she can give you her direct contact." Inigo looked at him for a moment, then at Valentina, then smiled again, this time with the quick understanding of someone who knows how to read a room. "Of course," he said, and shifted the conversation with the grace of someone who decides not to push on a door that's just been quietly closed. Valentina took a sip of water to hide what was happening with her mouth, something very close to a smile. She said nothing. Neither did he. But for the rest of the lunch, Alejandro Vidal listened to every word Valentina said with an attention that had nothing professional about it, and she noticed, and they both pretended not to. The return train left 20 minutes late. They got back to Madrid past 8, hungry in the particular way of people who'd spent a lunch talking business and barely eating. "There's a place near Recoletos," Alejandro said as they walked out of Atocha station. "If you don't have other plans." It wasn't exactly an invitation. It wasn't exactly an instruction either. It was that in-between territory he was starting to move into, one Valentina still didn't have a name for. "I don't have other plans," she said. The restaurant was small, warm, candles on the tables, a short menu. Nothing like the places they usually met for work. Nobody there knew them. There was no strategic reason to be in that place. That, in itself, was something. They talked for 2 hours, not about work, not really. They talked about Madrid, about how the Malasana neighborhood had changed since Valentina had lived there, about her mother's slow but steady recovery, about a book they'd both read without knowing the other had read it too, about why Alejandro didn't have a single plant in his apartment, despite having a living room with perfect light for them. "I don't have time," he said. "Plants don't need time. They need consistency. Those are different things." "What's the practical difference?" "Time is quantity. Consistency is intention." He looked at her from across the table with an expression she'd started to recognize, the look of someone who'd just heard something he wasn't expecting and was deciding what to do with it. "You say things that sound simple and aren't," he said. "You say things that sound complicated and also aren't." The candle between them flickered. Outside, Madrid carried on with its night, indifferent as ever. They were the last to leave the restaurant. The waiter waited with Madrid's particular patience, meaning no rush at all, but his coat already on. Outside, the December cold was different from November's, drier, more final. Valentina turned up her coat collar. They walked together toward the taxi stand without discussing it. On the sidewalk, under the yellow glow of a street lamp, Alejandro stopped. Valentina. She turned. He was a step away. The cold had brought a little color to his face, or maybe it was the light, or maybe it was something with no meteorological explanation at all. What I said in Barcelona, not yet. You don't have to explain it. I don't want to explain it, he said. I want you to know it wasn't strategy. Valentina looked at him. The traffic on Recoletos passed behind them. Someone laughed on a nearby terrace. Madrid was loud, even when it was trying to be intimate. Then what was it? She asked quietly. Alejandro took a second. Too. A truth, said too early, he said. And in that moment, with the cold between them, the city around them, 2 hours of real conversation still hanging in the air, he raised his hand and brushed a strand of hair from her face. A gesture so simple, so human, so completely unlike everything this man had been for 3 years, that Valentina didn't know whether to step forward or back. She did neither. She stood still, looking at him, her heart doing things it hadn't asked permission to do. He lowered his hand slowly, let it fall. A taxi turned the corner, its light on. Good night, Valentina, he said. Good night, she answered, and got into the taxi. He stayed on the sidewalk until the car turned the corner, and Valentina, leaning back against her seat, watching the lights of Madrid slide by the window, realized she was smiling without having decided to. A small smile, no witnesses, completely useless. She put it away before it could grow, but it had been there. Has anyone ever told you half a truth, and somehow, without anyone explaining it, you knew the other half was the part that mattered? Tell us in the comments. December brought the year's real cold, and a complication Valentina hadn't accounted for. Your own feelings, it turns out, are much harder to manage than other people's. She'd started noticing things she hadn't noticed before. The way Alejandro tapped his index finger twice on the table when he was thinking something he wasn't ready to say yet. The fact that he never arrived late, but always waited until she had her coffee before starting any important meeting. The way that when something truly bothered him, his voice didn't rise, it dropped, went quieter, more precise, like a scalpel. She was studying him, and that was a warning sign she chose to ignore. It was an afternoon in the second week of December when she overheard the conversation. It wasn't intentional. She was walking down the hallway toward the printing room when she passed Alejandro's office. The door, usually closed, was ajar, and the voices carried with the unintentional clarity of poorly sealed rooms. It was him and someone on speakerphone. The situation with Del Solar is resolving itself, Alejandro was saying. Atlantica already has the documents. The contract should close this week. The voice on the phone said something. And the girl, that resolves itself too, once the deal closes. A pause. The public relationship with her is useful to us until the deal closes. Valentina stopped in the hallway. The cold she felt had nothing to do with December. She didn't hear anything else, not because the conversation ended, but because she walked away, slowly, with steps that sounded normal even though they weren't, and went back to her desk and opened a document on her computer that she didn't read for the next 12 minutes. The public relationship with her is useful to us until the deal closes. Isabel Montes had been right. He protects things he considers useful. It had all been strategy. The trip to Barcelona, the small restaurant near Recoletos, the strand of hair brushed back on the sidewalk, the truth said too early. All of it had been part of a narrative that served him, that protected his position against Del Solar, that closed a contract. And she had started to believe it. She closed the document, opened her email, and started typing. What Valentina didn't hear, because she'd already walked away, was what Alejandro said 3 sentences later. The voice on the phone asked something else, and he answered with a coldness that wasn't indifference at all, but something else entirely. But if anyone uses her name to come after her again, I cancel the entire deal. And that's not negotiable. The voice on the other end paused. Are you serious? I never joke about reputation, Alejandro said. Mine, or anyone else's. Silence on the line. He ended the call and stood for a moment, looking at the half-open door of his office, with the strange certainty that something had just left the hallway that wasn't coming back. The resignation letter was short. Valentina was efficient even in the moments when it would have been understandable not to be. Dear Mr. Vidal, I am writing to inform you of my decision to resign from my position as executive assistant, effective January 2nd. I'm grateful for the 3 years we've worked together, and I wish Vidal Group every success going forward. She left it on his desk at 6 in the evening, while he was still in his office. Then she gathered her bag, her personal planner, the small photo of her mother she kept in her drawer, and left. He found it 10 minutes later. He walked out of his office, envelope in hand, to an empty hallway. He called her that night. She didn't answer. He called again the next morning. She picked up on the third ring. Valentina, the Atlantica contract closes this week, she said, in a voice that was perfectly professional and had taken her 2 hours to build. The arrangement we had is over. The resignation follows from that. It doesn't follow from anything. I heard the conversation, Alejandro. A pause. Which part? He asked, and there was something in his voice she'd never heard from him before. Urgency. Just enough of it. Valentina, I need you to hear the rest. There's no rest that changes what I heard. Yes, there is. You said the public relationship with me was useful to you until the deal closed. That's clear enough. That's half a sentence. It's the half that matters. A long pause. He was choosing his words. She knew that. Alejandro Vidal always chose his words. The problem was, this time, she didn't want to wait for him to find them. I don't want to be anyone's useful piece, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. I've been that once already. I'm not doing it again. You're not. Take good care of whoever comes next. I know HR has a strong shortlist. A pause. Goodbye, Alejandro. She hung up. She sat on her sofa, phone face down on her knee, and breathed. Once. Twice. She didn't cry. Or, almost didn't. There was a brief stretch, maybe 40 seconds, where her eyes filled and the apartment blurred, but she held it back. She tucked it away in that internal place where things that hurt too much to look at directly get stored. Then she got up, went to the kitchen, made tea, and called her mother. Alejandro, for his part, did something he hadn't done in years. He canceled 2 meetings. Not postponed, canceled. He stayed in his office with the resignation letter on his desk, and that morning's conversation replaying in his head with the irritating fidelity of things that can't be undone. He'd spent 40 years learning to control rooms, conversations, outcomes, to anticipate every variable, to never let anything catch him off guard. And still, he picked up the phone, set it down, picked it up again, and called his lawyer. I need you to look at something, he said. The clause in my will. The one about the company trust. The lawyer paused. Do you want to change it? I want to understand what it cost me to build it, Alejandro said, and whether it was worth it. Some people, when they lose something that matters, don't cry, don't shout, don't send messages. At 3 in the morning, they cancel meetings, call their lawyer, stare at a wall, and all of that, however cold it looks, is exactly the same thing as crying. Just in a language very few people speak. 3 weeks passed since that call. The Atlantica contract closed that same week, as expected. Marcos del Solar was cut out of the negotiation entirely once the documents about the stolen project reached the board of directors. There was no public scandal. In that world, scandals get digested in private. But his reputation in the industry began to crack, with the quiet, relentless certainty of things everyone knows even when nobody says them out loud. Valentina heard about it from a former colleague who called her, stunned, to say someone had presented evidence. Valentina didn't ask who. She already knew. The sector's year-end gala was the last major event of December. Valentina hadn't organized it this time. She no longer worked at Vidal Group. She'd spent those 3 weeks having coffee with her mother in Getafe, updating her resume, dusting off the Rios Estrategia business plan she'd kept buried in a folder on her computer labeled, generically, various ideas, so she wouldn't have to look at it directly. She opened it one afternoon. She read it. It was good. Maybe better than she remembered. She went to the gala because the director of the Barcelona investment group had personally invited her. He'd gotten her contact through Vidal Group, wanting to talk to her about an independent project. It was a real professional opportunity. Going was the right call. She put on a dark green dress. No, the blue one. The blue one held too much memory. She arrived alone, greeted the Barcelona director, spoke for 20 minutes about the project with a clarity and confidence that surprised even her. took a glass of wine, moved through the room with the ease that comes from having organized too many events just like it. That's when Marcos del Solar appeared at her side. He'd come alone this time, and something about his posture had changed. Still the same man, but with less weight behind him, like a balloon that had lost some air. Marcos, I came to tell you something. It's not necessary. I came to tell you, he continued, ignoring the interruption with less grace than usual, that what happened with the project was a mistake. What I did. Valentina looked at him, studied his face, looked for the trap, the edge, the hidden layer beneath the words. Found nothing. Or maybe she was just too tired to keep looking. I know, she said. Can I? No, she said, with a calm that wasn't coldness, something far more solid than coldness. Don't tell me you can explain it. I don't need you to explain it. What I needed was proof that it was mine. And now it exists. Marcos nodded slowly. Vidal did that. I did that, she said. He found the file. I decided what to do with it. Small difference. It wasn't small. Marcos looked at her a moment longer, nodded once without adding anything, and walked away. Valentina didn't watch him go. She was already looking somewhere else. Alejandro Vidal arrived at 9 o'clock, as always. He crossed the entrance to the ballroom and saw her before she saw him, dark green, glass in hand, talking to someone in the industry with that full attention she gave every conversation. No tablet, no notebook, none of the professional armor she always wore. Only she took a moment to move. He used that moment to recognize something he'd spent weeks denying with the efficiency of a man who had built his entire life around control, that the last 3 months had been the most alive he'd felt in years, that canceling those 2 meetings had been the first truly personal decision he'd made in longer than he could calculate, that the clause in his will was already rewritten, and that all of it had a name that wasn't strategy. He walked toward her. Valentina saw him when he was 10 meters away. She didn't move. She watched him approach with the expression she'd learned to wear when she didn't want anything to show, the same expression he wore, and they both knew it. I didn't expect to see you here, she said, when he was close. I didn't come for the event, he said. A pause. Then why did you come? Alejandro didn't answer right away. He glanced briefly around the room, the tables, the lights, as if he needed a second to place himself in the space before placing himself in the conversation. I heard what you didn't, he said finally. The second half. Valentina gripped her glass tighter. I said that if anyone used your name to attack you, I'd cancel the entire contract. His voice was low, direct, no decoration. I said it in that same call, 3 sentences after what you heard. And I would have done it. The noise of the ballroom existed somewhere behind them. Valentina didn't hear it. That doesn't change the first part, she said. No, but it completes it. He paused. The public relationships suited us, but I'd stopped thinking of it as strategy weeks before, and I think you knew that too. What I knew or didn't know, Valentina. It was the first time he'd said her name like that, with that texture, without the professional tone. I can talk about contracts and strategy for the rest of the night, if that's what you need. But what I came to say is simpler than all of that. She waited. You left, he said. And I canceled 2 meetings, and called my lawyer to change a document that took me 10 years to build. Strategy doesn't do that. Something else does. And I'm not good at naming that something else. But I think you are. Valentina looked at him for a long moment. The ballroom existed. The music existed. The 200 people around them existed. I got scared, she said quietly. Not of you. Of starting to need you close, and not knowing if it was real. It was real, he said. It is real. How do I know? Because I'm here. A pause. And because I never learned how to do things halfway. Valentina let out the breath she'd been holding. Then she did something she hadn't planned. She placed her hand on his chest, over the lapel of his jacket, with gentle pressure, as if checking that what stood in front of her was real and solid, and actually there. He didn't move. He glanced down at her hand for a moment, then looked back up at her, and kissed her. It wasn't a long, perfectly lit movie kiss. It was brief, contained, with the noise of the ballroom around them and the clink of 200 people's glasses, none of them watching. It was a real kiss, the kind that comes from something that's been building for a long time and finally finds the place it fits. When they pulled apart, her eyes were closed. Then she opened them. He was looking at her with an expression that wasn't quite nothing anymore. It was, exactly, everything. Proposal, Valentina said quietly, with a seriousness that had humor underneath it. I'm listening. Rios Estrategia, as an independent consultancy. Vidal Group as its first client. Not as your assistant. He looked at her. That's a condition. It's the only one. Accepted. No hesitation. No favoritism, she added. I never give it. I know. A pause. That's why I'm proposing it. They didn't go to their usual place. There was no strategy, no agenda, no professional reason to justify what happened after the kiss. Just the simple fact that neither of them wanted the night to end, and that Madrid in December is a city that knows when not to interrupt. They walked 4 blocks without deciding to, talking little, in a silence that no longer meant distance, quite the opposite. At some point he offered her his arm with the same ease he'd open a door. And she took it with the same ease you accept something you've wanted for a long time without ever naming it. Alejandro's apartment was in Salamanca, in a stone building with a doorman and a silent elevator. Valentina had always known that, the same way she knew his direct phone number and the exact time he arrived every morning. She'd known it as a professional fact, and had never once imagined she'd actually be there. The entryway was exactly as she'd pictured it, orderly without being sterile, one lamp lit, casting the living room in a warm half-light. No plants, as she knew. Books, as she'd suspected. Want anything? He asked. No. It wasn't rudeness. Neither of them had come here to sit in the living room. He looked at her from the center of the room. She was still in her coat, bag in hand, standing by the door they'd just closed, and there was something about that image, her standing there in a space that was entirely his, looking at him like it was the first time she was truly seeing him. That did something in his chest he didn't have a name for and didn't need one. He came closer, slowly. Valentina didn't move. She watched him approach with the expression he'd learned to read over the past few months, the look of someone who's already made a decision and is waiting for the world to catch up. He took the bag from her hand, set it on the nearest chair without looking where it landed. Then he undid the buttons of her coat, one by one, with a slowness that wasn't hesitation, it was the opposite. And when he slid it off her shoulders, his hand stayed there, resting against the green dress, feeling the warmth of her through the fabric. Valentina, he said quietly. You don't have to say anything, she answered. I know. He kissed her. This time it wasn't brief, or contained, or surrounded by 200 people. This time it was long and real, his hands at her waist, pulling her close slowly, as if he'd decided not to rush, even though he'd been rushing toward this for months. She felt the warmth of his chest against hers, the scent of him mixed with the cold of the street still clinging to their clothes, and something in her that had been wound tight for weeks, for months, for longer than she wanted to count, let go. He drew her further in without fully letting go, as if distance were a risk neither of them was willing to take. The room sat in half-light. The city carried on outside, mute and indifferent, as always. What followed was warmth and closeness, and 2 heartbeats finding the same rhythm, and the December cold stayed entirely on the other side of the window, irrelevant, far away. At 7 in the morning, the light of Madrid came through the blinds and slanted bars, and Valentina opened her eyes. It took her exactly 2 seconds to remember where she was. Alejandro slept beside her with that same stillness he carried everywhere, a man who, it turned out, controlled even his sleep. But there was something relaxed at the corner of his mouth she'd never seen during the day. Younger, maybe. Or just more him, without the armor. She lay still, watching the bars of light on the ceiling, listening to Madrid wake up outside, and thought that there were 2 ways to be somewhere, passing through, or truly there, and that this morning, in this apartment with no plants and too many books, was the first time in a long while she'd felt the second one. He opened his eyes, looked at her, didn't say good morning. Didn't say anything, just looked at her with the expression she already knew how to read, and reached over to brush the hair from her face, the same way he had on the sidewalk near Recoletos, weeks ago, except without the distance this time. I have coffee, he said finally. Good. Reasonable. I'll take it. He got up. She heard the sounds of the kitchen, water, the coffee maker, and lay there a moment longer, looking at the ceiling, thinking that this man had taken 3 years to ask if she'd eaten, and was now making her coffee at 7 in the morning in December. That some things, apparently, really were worth the wait. Rios Estrategia opened its offices in the Chueca neighborhood one Tuesday in March, with 4 confirmed clients, 2 employees, and a plant by the window that Valentina had bought on the very first day. Plants don't need time, she told Alejandro, when he asked if it wasn't too soon to have plants. They need consistency. He didn't argue. The proposal happened in Getafe, in Valentina's mother's apartment. A Sunday in June. No expensive restaurant. No ocean view. No ring hidden in a champagne glass. Just an ordinary Sunday. Rice pudding that Diana had made because it was her daughter's favorite dessert, and Alejandro Vidal, a man who never asked anything personal and now asked far too much, pulling a small box out of his jacket pocket after coffee and setting it on the table without ceremony. I know you have conditions, he said, looking at Valentina. I always do. This time I only have one question. Diana, from the other side of the table, pretended to look out the window with a discretion that fooled no one. Valentina looked at the box, then at him. What's the question? If you want to build something with me, he said. That isn't just a contract. Valentina opened the box. The ring was simple, white gold, a small stone, the kind you could wear your whole life without ever growing tired of it. Is this the closest thing to a declaration of love you know how to make? She asked. For now, you'll have to keep improving me. I know. So, will you be improving me, or saying yes? Both, Valentina said. Diana stopped looking out the window. The small wedding took place in October, with Madrid's autumn painting the trees of the Retiro in every shade of orange. 40 guests, live music, and a groom's speech that lasted exactly 4 minutes and made the bride's mother cry, along with 2 Vidal group partners who would never admit it. Valentina wore the midnight blue dress, bought with that long-ago bonus. Not the green one. Not something new. The blue one, the one from the night where it all began. It wasn't a nostalgic choice. It was the opposite. That night at the gala had been the beginning of something, not the symbol of a fear. And somewhere between December and October, she'd decided that the things that mark a beginning deserve a place in what gets built afterward. Alejandro noticed it when she reached the altar. He didn't say anything, but for exactly 2 seconds, something in his face was completely unlike anything anyone had ever seen there before. Then he took her hand, and that was enough. And now, the final question. Has someone ever shown you they truly knew you, not with words, but with a gesture only you could understand? Tell us in the comments. We're reading.